Well, this weekend, our family jumped into one of the busy seasons of our life, and that is spring sports in the Seymour household. We have two track folks, Emmy and Luke, and then Jesse's in his senior year of baseball. And Friday night we had a scrimmage, and it was like 34 or something, and windy, and not primarily baseball weather. I didn't take that picture there. That was somewhere else. But we have had times in spring sports where I know one time I was with the younger ones, and Christy was at a baseball game in Pickerington, and she texted me a picture, and on her sleeve and her glove was snow from being at the game and just sitting there and snow getting on her. You can get like sunburn at a track meet in Ohio with your kids, and the next day you could get frostbite at it. Weather in Ohio is not conducive to spring sports. Now, it reminded me of a quote in a book I was reading on marriage, and it said this, the quote said, "Making a marriage in the current culture is much like growing an English rose garden on a West Texas cattle ranch. It can be done, but the weather rarely cooperates. Growing a marriage, a people-healthy, God-honoring marriage, can, with determination, be done. The couple attempting such a marriage soon discovers, however, that the culture around them provides little in the way of nurturing environment or encouragement for the project. It's one reason we're doing this marriage series is because it's just tough in our current culture to do marriage. It's one reason we did the date night, was just to create a fun, safe place for couples to have a date night, to get some free childcare, and then to have a safe discussion about marriage near the end of that date night. It's why, again, I thought we should do our series, this little 3-week series we're doing before Easter, because, the culture, meaning the discussion among people, your friends, the music, the movies, the TV shows, there really isn't much out there that is promoting people-healthy, God-honoring, lifelong marriage. And so we have to try to create our own culture to do that. So where would we start if we were going to try to build that kind of culture? Well, the first place to start is with God, because we believe the Bible is true, that we believe this is God's written word to us. We believe that God created marriage. It's not a human system, not a human construct, but actually God created this thing called marriage. And so we're going to go back to Him, and we're trying to figure out, why did He create it? How did He create it? How did He create it to function? It's much like the owner's manual of a car. You follow the owner's manual of a car so that you know the purpose of the car, how to take care of the car, how it functions best. It's the same thing with marriage. We got to go back and see, how did God design marriage to work? And that's what we're doing last week, and then today, and then next week. So what we're hoping will happen is that, before a culture can be created, we have to have a deep conviction. Whether we're singles, whether we're marrieds, whether we're divorced, whether we're widowed, we have to have this deep conviction about whatever we're talking about. We're having to talk about marriage now. You have to have a deep conviction, and if enough people have a deep conviction and you begin to move towards changing not just your own life, but others around us begin to change, you can create a culture. And my prayer is that at Vineyard, we would have a culture that helps people have people-healthy, God-honoring marriages. Last week, we learned that our current culture views marriage as a vehicle for personal happiness. People get married for personal validation. They get married to have my needs met or for personal fulfillment. All of those are self-focused, and if each partner in a marriage is self-focused, then it gets pretty broken fairly quickly. God has a different purpose for marriage. The primary use, I think, of marriage, and we'll see this in future teachings, is the primary thing I think He wants to do is use marriage to make us holy first, way before it makes us happy. I believe joy will come, but only after each partner allows God to use marriage to deal with our own personal selfishness. When God created marriage, He had a blueprint in mind, and He lays this blueprint out in Genesis 1. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 2. Actually, we're going to go there. He starts His project in 1. We looked at that last week briefly, and today we're going to look at Genesis 2 again. We learned that the passage that we studied last week and the passage we're going to study this week was quoted no less verbatim 4 times, and it's alluded to several more times after that in the New Testament, several thousand years after the events we're reading about today happened. And what it does is Jesus and the early followers of Jesus, anytime they would teach about marriage, they would go back to this as a foundational blueprint for our lives, and they would say, this is why God did this, and this is how marriage ought to function. So it's incredibly important for followers of Jesus to know this. We learned last week that step 1 was leaving. The first thing that God said after he created Adam and Eve and instituted marriage, he said, for this reason you will leave your father and your mother. And we learned that leaving is obviously physical separation, establishing another home with somebody, but it's also emotional and mental, right? Leaving. That our spouse should have more influence on our life than our parents. That we still honor our parents, we love our parents, we still can hang out a bunch, we can hang out weekly or every other day we can hang out, but is a mental and an emotional shift where I start a new family unit that has priority in my life. Up until you're married, your immediate family has priority in your life, but when you get married, it all switches to what you and your spouse create. As you turn to Genesis 2, let me just answer quickly why listen to this teaching. Well, if you're married, then it's pretty obvious. If you have a good marriage, then God is a good God. He wants you to have a great marriage, and so you can learn some things for that. If your marriage is in crisis or needs maintenance, my prayer is you'll hear some things that can help you pull up from the crash. I think if you have kids, it'll help you train your kids. If you have grandkids, this can be nuggets that you can share with your grandkids. If you're single, then a couple things. One is, if you think you're going to end up getting married, then this teaching can be beneficial because it's preparing you. You're beginning internally so that you begin to see marriage in the right way. Because again, we just all confess, our culture is not producing healthy marriages and doesn't help us view marriage the way God does. So this will help. If you're single, it helps as friends ask advice. Or you're talking about marriage around the water cooler at work or with friends or coworkers or family members. If you're single and you have kids or grandkids, then again, you can use this with them. And honestly, a lot of what I'm sharing is really just some relationship basics. Not necessarily romantic relationships or marriage, that's a specific, but what I'm sharing really is general, and you're going to see that in one part of this teaching today, that some of what God's setting up in marriage is really how community ought to work. Well, let's look at the second part of the blueprint right after God creates Eve for Adam and Adam for Eve. Take a look at Genesis 2, verses 24 and 25. This is right after God created marriage and created Adam and Eve for one another. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. If the leave part is the first part of God's blueprint for marriage, then the second part is to be united. You see that phrase there, to be united. Now, actually, it's a weak phrase. I don't think it conveys enough. The Old English word probably is a little better. It means to cleave. And I don't know that we use that word a whole lot. But to cleave means to cling, to grow close to intentionally hold on to. Not just once, but over and over again, to be intentional, to hold on to one another, to cling together. It is the same Hebrew word. When you think of when the Hebrews would use the word, it would be like thinking about glue. They use the word cleave or to be united to talk about glue and how glue helps things cling together. So one of the things we're doing in our marriages is we're actually helping people, or we're choosing in our own marriages to cling, to grow close to one another. I got it my little elementary school purple glue stick. And so they would say, if you were gluing something together, they would use the word cleave or cling or be united. And what God is saying here to the Hebrews when they first read this in the Old Testament, they're saying, you know what, it's the same. It's the same here with marriage, is that we should be in choosing intentionally to cling to one another in our marriages. Now, in the beginning, we may be drawn to our spouse for all kinds of reasons. If you're married, do you remember, or if you've been married, do you remember like what drew you to your spouse? I mean, it could be because they're attractive. It could be that you had some kind of hormonal reaction, chemical reaction. It may be their humor. You may be attracted to marriage because everybody else was getting married. It may have been a way to start a new life or get out of your house. It may be that you like the safety and the stability that marriage can provide. Those are many other reasons are why we may initially reach out to our spouse. But what clinging is, what cleaving is, it is intentionally choosing to stay in sync with my spouse, to continue to reach out towards my spouse instead of pulling away. We intentionally choose to have emotional and functional connection with our spouse. We choose to cling to them, not waiting for them to choose us. We're continually choosing them and cleaving or clinging to them. Now, there's some real world applications to cleaving for your everyday life. I mean, it means that you and your spouse would be in sync. You decide that you decide to be with your spouse and to work with your spouse instead of working against your spouse. People who've been married very long, like perhaps 48 or 72 hours, they learn quickly that you're not always have a predisposition to work with your spouse, right? There are just some days, for whatever reason, you wake up crossways and you're working against your spouse. Like everything they do and everything you do, everybody have those days? Or am I just being vulnerable and all of you are really, really healthy? Because we have those days at times where we're not in sync, you know? To cleave and to work with them, it doesn't mean like you're the lost puppy that follows them around. Hey, Spike, what are you doing today, Spike? You know, that's not like that. It's not clinging in a creepy stalker kind of way, you know. What it does mean is to be in sync or moving in the same direction. It's why I get nervous sometimes when one spouse will get really, really, really gung-ho about one thing in their life, and you can tell the other one isn't gung-ho. I always think, I don't know if they're cleaving anymore, clinging. One person really, really gets hot about a hobby. And it's not that we don't have different things to do. I'm not talking about that at all. But we should be working with one another. Somebody gets a hobby and they just invest all their time and all their energy and all their resources. And I've seen it where they quit cleaving to their spouse. Sometimes I've seen people go after it in fitness that way. I've seen people go after that in ministry. I've seen them go in career, education, where they just go after something so hard and they leave their spouse behind. We're to be in sync. Again, it doesn't mean we're all doing the same things, but we should be working together. If you're married and you're here, let me just ask you this. Are you clinging to something or someone more than your spouse? Sometimes we cling to our rights, our freedom. You know, what our self wants more than our spouse. You will never experience the oneness, the community, the communion, the union that God has for you if you're trying to meet your needs by feeding yourself over and over again. There will still be a hole of aloneness, even if you leave your spouse. Like, it only happens when we choose to be in sync with our spouse and cling to them. Another area that we can practically cleave is in household chores. We cling to our spouses and we move in the same direction as our spouse when we work together, when we divide and conquer, or perhaps we do the same chores. Gender doesn't determine what you should do or shouldn't do. If I'm cleaving to Christy, if I'm clinging to her, then I should be involved in the activities that she's involved in. That includes household chores. You may decide to divide and conquer. You may decide to do it together, whether it's laundry or oil changes or changing dirty diapers or furnace filters. You know, she doesn't lose her femininity, nor do I lose my masculinity, depending on what role we do. It doesn't matter. We're cleaving. We're clinging to one another. And when you do that, you're doing it in service to Jesus. It's like worship. Like when you choose to be in sync with your spouse, you're doing it as a service to Jesus. It's worship. Because this is how he designed your life to work. So you're obeying him by cleaving and being in sync with your spouse. It can work out practically as a husband chooses to participate in activities their wife enjoys and vice versa. I'm not a scrapbooker. There was this time to save money. I didn't plan on telling this, but there was this time that to save money, my mother-in-law worked at an OBGYN, gynecologist, if you don't know what that means. And she was a nurse there, and to save money, I was getting allergy shots there, and so it was great because I was the only guy in the place getting medical attention. And so one time they ran out of rooms for me to be in, and so I'm sitting in the waiting room, and I'd just gotten my shot, and a very pregnant lady and her husband and mother-in-law come, and they sit. The bench is small. We're all like this, right on the bench, and my mother-in-law, Jackie, comes up and goes, "Hey, I need to look at your injection site." And so she rolls up my sleeve, and I can just feel these, 6 eyeballs, like, "You've got an injection here?" Like, she looks, she says, "Okay, you're not having an allergic reaction, you're good." And so I look, I said, "Hey, my wife really wanted me to get in touch with my feminine side, and so I've been getting estrogen shots, and I really like doing arts and crafts and scrapbooking now." The husband and the mother-in-law picked up immediately that I was joking. The pregnant lady was just like, "No, didn't get estrogen shots." I'm not particular. I don't scrapbook, but you know what? I love it. She's working on Jesse's, graduation scrapbook. I love coming home and she shows me the things she made. I mean, if we're out and about and there's a store we see, hey, let's go to that scrapbook store. She's not particularly into Harleys or electric guitars, but when we're out and about, she'll say, "Hey, there's a Harley store. Why don't you swing in today? There's a guitar shop. Why don't you swing in today?" Why? Because we're trying to cling and cleave to one another and be into what one another is into. You can practice this in your daily activities. You can practice it around dinner, about how dinner is prepared and how dinner gets cleaned up. It may be one prepares and one cleans, or maybe you do it all together. Again, we resist thinking about roles as manly or more feminine. If the woman is more the breadwinner and works outside the home, that doesn't make her less feminine. And if the husband stays at home and helps with laundry, that doesn't make him less manly. It is that two people are choosing to cling to each other, be in sync with each other, and that honors God. He's worshiped when we do that. It's not a one-time thing. It is a daily choosing to cling and cleave. I remember one time, Christy and I, we were getting bunk beds for the boys when they were much littler. It was a couple months ago. No, it was years ago, maybe a decade ago even. And we're getting the bunk beds, and we're going to go up to Sam's Club, and we had a minivan that didn't have a third seat, and just to be able to get these 2 big boxes in, we needed to take 2 vehicles. And for one reason or another, we just woke up and we were not in sync. And I can't speak for her, but I know I was choosing not to be in sync. I was choosing not to cleave. And I can just remember we were just at odds, and we get in the car, and I had to make a couple errands, and we're getting on each other's nerves. I get in the car, I'm driving, and I'm doing the Fred Flintstone cuss, racking, and racking, like that, right? And so anyway, I was just doing that, and I flipped on the radio, and thinking about Christy and why she did this and why she did that and this is stupid and she's stupid, all those things going through my head. And I flip on the radio, I kid you not, it was the pastor of Columbus Vineyard, and it was a sermon, and the first thing out of his mouth is he said, "You know what? Lots of thoughts go through our heads, and not all of them are our own, that many times Satan throws a couple thoughts our way, we grab a hold of them, and then we start thinking like that, and we need to recognize when it's bad thinking or even satanic thinking, just put a stop to it." And he gave a few examples, and all of a sudden it hit me. Wait a second. I love my wife. I have a great wife, What am I doing? Why am I thinking this way? I just renounce that bad thinking, and I'm going to intentionally choose to think well of her and good of her and cling and cleave to her. And the day changed. That's what cleaving means. It's an intentional change in the way you think about your spouse. Are you actively, continually clinging to your spouse? Or continue to do that? When Jesus was asked, and because of time, I can't go into detail, but when Jesus was asked about marriage and people were looking for loopholes out of their marriage, Jesus was asked about that, and he came back to this very verse, and he not only said, "Here's the blueprint," and he said it, leaving and cleaving in one flesh, and we'll talk about one flesh next week, but he not only gave the blueprint, but then he gave the purpose for this blueprint, the purpose for this design, and he says, "What God has put together, let nobody tear apart." Part of the deal that I think, I know there's all kinds of, so please don't think this is simplistic, solves every case. I know it doesn't. I've been involved in too many broken marriages with broken people. But I think one of the things we could do to help up the likelihood that we'd have lifelong marriage is to practice these three things. And part of it is just to choose to cleave, to choose to be in sync. There's just great value in that. And it leads to lifelong, people-healthy, God-honoring marriages. In a recent study, they asked a bunch of people who had been married over 50-plus years, what was the secret or what did they like most, had all these questions. And one of the things that came out of the study that they said is we loved it that with all the changes in life and in my world, there was at least one constant. Now, does that mean your spouse never changes? You've been married more than 3 months, you could figure they change, right? They're a little different than when we dated. We change, they change, but they're there. There's something about permanence that we're missing out on this culture. We're so self-driven for happiness and fulfillment and self-actualization and getting my needs met. Here's what we forget, that there is something that can only be built and only be gotten by long-term healthy relationships. And that's, I think, the example of marriage is an example that God has for a Christian community to begin with. I mean, the community we're talking about here is husband, wife, and God. And this, just like the Trinity is a triangle, this is a triangle of loving community. But I think it means, like any friendship or any I think small group. We recently cut some videos for our 20th anniversary, and we just said, why are you still here? And I won't give it all away because we're going to show one of it. But one of the things that kept coming out was the people around the table kept saying, I've seen such transformation. That it's not always been easy. We've went through, each of us have had our own brokenness, or each of us have hurt one another, and yet we worked through forgiveness, and we worked through conflict, and what came out of it was deep-seated community where we have more intimacy as friends because we can be more vulnerable, and there's a safe place there because it's long-term relationship. I think it's the same not only in small groups, it's the same in churches. That's why I'm a proponent of long-term spiritual relationships and not hopping from friend to friend to friend. I mean, you can have many friends, but I think you need some places where you can be who you are long-term and warts and all and confrontation and be like sandpaper at times and yet you still love one another, right? If we want that kind of transformation, it's going to have to come through long-term relationships. Same in marriage, long-term. And the blueprint for that, Jesus said, was leaving and cleaving and practicing one flesh. We glued our paper earlier today, and I think even the pain, and I'm not going to use the same one because I did it a little later in the sermon, but I did glue this one earlier today. And part of just the deal of if you try to pull apart, even the pain that we feel, like if you're in a long-term friendship and you pull apart, or you're in a long-term small group and for some reason it blows apart, or you've ever been a part of a church split, if you've ever been a part of a divorce, the pain actually proves what God was trying to say, that this thing wasn't meant to blow apart. The purpose all along was lifelong. Because there's such a weaving of our personalities and our souls. Something mystical happens when we're married. If we try to pull apart, even on that day, like when Christy and I were out of sync, and it's happened a couple more times in 10 years, last couple weeks, even don't you just feel that, even if you're not even thinking about separation or divorce, just when you're out of sync, you feel that, right? It's a sign that God created this be lifelong. The way to do that is through his blueprint of leaving and cleaving and being one flesh. If we practice God's blueprint for marriage, then we up the likelihood we'll experience the purpose of that blueprint, which is a people-healthy, God-honoring, lifelong relationship. And a huge part of that is clinging. I heard Greg Laurie, as a pastor out in California, say, clinging or cleaving isn't like the fly hitting the fly paper. You ever hung fly paper? Some of you are old enough to have that. You hang the fly, little strips. And when a fly hits that, is the fly intentionally choosing to cling? No, it's doing this, right? This is not cleaving or clinging, right? It has to be this intentional choice that I will be in sync with my spouse and I will be for my spouse. Think of it this way: as the weather begins to break and you go up to Mount Pleasant and take a hike, let's say you just see this beautiful view and you get out, over to the edge, and you're looking out over the beautiful city and your foot slips and you fall and you turn around and you grab a hold of a tree root there. That's intentional clinging and cleaving, right? That's I'm going to do it. It's not a one-time thing, right? I made my vow on Mount Pleasant. I will cleave to this root. Okay, did it. No, it's I'm hanging on. And again, I'm not saying that's how we strangle our spouse or hang on like some crazy puppy or creepy stalker. But what I am saying is it has to be intentional. If it's not intentional and ongoing, the word here that is even an ongoing action, it has to be intentional and ongoing. Are you cleaving to your spouse? Since we're all broken and wounded people, this is admittedly hard to do, but it's not impossible. Exquisite rose gardens actually do exist in Texas. I found quite a few. It just takes a whole lot of work because the weather doesn't cooperate, does it? It takes intentionality. It takes a plan. And I think what God's calling us to do, even down to you all who are younger over here, some of you are younger out there, but not most of you. But over here, there's a pocket of young folks. Even like you all, it is preparing now mentally for what marriage is. It's preparing now. And if you're already married or you're thinking about getting married, it is beginning to form your heart about the purpose and design of marriage that God has. And realizing a God-honoring, people-healthy, lifelong marriage will not happen on accident because the weather, or in this case, the culture, doesn't cooperate. You're going to have to be intentional. And one of the big areas you're going to have to be intentional about is choosing to cleave to your spouse. Let me just pray for us real quick, okay? Holy Spirit, we invite your presence to come into our minds and our relationships because we just realize our thinking isn't real good about marriage because of what we're surrounded by. And so we've been talking about cleaving to our spouse or our future spouse or potential, or even just talking about in community, in friendships, in church life, in small group, of choosing to be in sync with our friends and our church family or our other brothers and sisters in Christ and to think the best with them and not work against them but work with them. We just admit this is tough. And so right now, I just invite all of us to choose to cleave to God, to cling to Him. We just admit, we confess, we need your help to do relationships, and I'm not just talking romantic relationships, but all to do them right in this culture is tough because the weather rarely cooperates. So we're just asking right now, Jesus, we're choosing to cling to you. And perhaps just as important, we open up our lives and say, God, would you cling to us? Because our grip isn't always the best. But we want to believe that song we sang earlier about reckless love, that you come after us, that you chase us, you long for us. So would you just grab a hold of our hearts right now? Let's come.